Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for tuning in to this online symposium. So my name's Holly. I'm going to talk to you about socioeconomic status and people's beliefs about how others see them. So I want to start by showing you all a couple of pretty famous tweets. So Justin Bieber tweeted this about how grateful he is for his fans and his fame. He seems almost surprised that so many people like him and like his music. But let's contrast this to another famous person's tweet. So Kanye West clearly expects 31 million people to like him, and he's a little confused that only 30.9 million are following him. So both artists seem to care a lot about what others think of them. In other words, Bieber and Kanye, like most of us, care a lot about their meta-perceptions, or our perceptions of how others perceive us. And these meta-perceptions are likely to matter for behavior, right? So, for example, if you really think everyone loves and respects you, like Kanye, might lead you to take some extreme political actions, like running for president. So why is it that Kanye expects 31 million people to love him and follow him on Twitter, but Bieber is just pleasantly surprised to have any followers, any fans? So in other words, why does Kanye have more positive meta-perceptions than Justin? Well, one reason might be their social class origins. Justin Bieber grew up working class, raised by a single mother in low-income housing, whereas Kanye grew up upper middle class, raised by a college professor mother and photojournalist father. In other words, I'm suggesting that social class is positively linked to meta-perceptions. So someone who grew up with money, like Kanye West, is going to expect others to see him more positively than someone who grew up more working class, like Justin Bieber. So I'll get to why this could be true in a minute, but first let me just show you some evidence that it is actually true. So we've now done 16 studies that had measures of social class and meta-perceptions. And these studies use a variety of methods, including hypothetical interactions, real online chat conversations, and live in-lab conversations. So I'll just show you results from a meta-analysis across all the studies. We measured meta-perceptions of both warmth and competence because these are the two major dimensions of interpersonal perception, and they encompass a lot of other traits. So if someone expects to be seen as both competent and warm, it seems fair to say they have positive meta-perceptions overall. So first, if we look at participants' childhood income, so if they grew up in a high-income family like Kanye West or low-income family like Justin Bieber, you can see that as we predicted, those who grew up in wealthier families expect others to see them as more competent than those who grew up in less wealthy families. And they also think people see them as more warm, so more likable and honest, compared to people who grew up in lower income families. So your parents' income when you were a child predicts how positively you believe others see you today. And in fact, we find the same thing when we look at people's current income. And the same thing, and even more so, when we ask them to self-report their social class. And then it's a bit different when we look at education. But overall, the results do support this idea pretty strongly, that social class positively predicts meta-perceptions in general, so meta-perceptions of both warmth and competence. But why is this the case? Well, one interesting part of this is that it conflicts with stereotypes. So we tend to see upper-class people as less warm, so maybe even kind of cold and evil, compared to those with lower social class, who we see as warmer. And there's other research suggesting people do often figure out their meta-perceptions based on how they expect people to stereotype them. So why are wealthy people so confident that others will think they're nice, moral people when we see that from the stereotype, that's not necessarily what people think? Well, one reason might be self-perceptions. So those with higher social class, like Kanye, tend to think they're pretty hot stuff. So in other words, they tend to have more positive self-perceptions in general. So higher self-esteem, higher narcissism, compared to those with lower social class. And these self-perceptions are strongly related to meta-perceptions. People who see themselves positively also think other people see them positively. And that is in fact what we find. So people with higher social class see themselves more positively, and people who see themselves positively expect others to see them more positively. And this indirect effect is significant. So one important thing to note, though, is this doesn't fully explain the relationship between social class and meta-perceptions. There's still this significant direct effect left over. So we were worried at one point that maybe we think we're measuring meta-perceptions, but all we're getting is just how people feel about themselves. Well, this suggests no, we're not just finding some fun new way to study self-esteem. There's actually something more going on here. So what is it? Well, another reason for the relationship between social class and meta perceptions could be self-presentation. People with higher social class tend to be more comfortable manipulating others for their own gain, so they might be more okay with presenting a fake or kind of overly positive version of themselves. And of course, it makes sense that if you plan to present yourself in a positive light, you'll expect others to see you in that positive light. And as we expected, both these mediators have significant and independent indirect effects. So people with high social class see themselves more positively, and they think they'll be able to give a better impression. And both those factors predict having more positive beliefs about how others will see you. So now we know social class does predict meta perceptions, but how accurate are these? So are lower class people right to expect others to see them more negatively, or maybe are wealthy people being overconfident in their predictions? To answer this, we used one of the data sets that was included in that meta-analysis I already showed you. And this was collected by our collaborator at McGill, Lauren Heumann. And in this study, around 500 undergraduate students came into the lab in small groups of 5 or 6, and then they interacted with each other in a round-robin design. It's like a speed dating setup, so everyone talks once to every other person. Before that, though, they reported demographics, including their income, and then after each interaction, they rated how they thought the other person saw them and how they saw the other person. So we want to look at how accurate these meta perceptions are. So in other words, how related are my beliefs about how someone sees me to how they actually saw me? And if I'm highly accurate, there's going to be a strong positive slope between how I think someone saw me and how they actually saw me. And so what you see here is most people are generally pretty accurate. So generally, as someone gets perceived more positively, they also think they're perceived more positively. But if anyone is less accurate, it's people who grew up in lower income families, as this interaction shows. So it doesn't look like it's the wealthy who are overconfident. If anything, it's these people who grew up poor that are doubting themselves more than they should. And we find the same pattern with household income and personal income. And this is interesting because it gives us a clue about one of the consequences of this relationship between social class and meta perceptions. So for example, imagine we were at one of the networking events that SPSP would typically be hosting. So if someone with lower social class is right that others see her negatively, maybe it would be a good decision for her to avoid approaching other people because she might embarrass herself if they really do perceive her negatively. But we actually don't find that to be the case. So if she were to walk up to some famous prof and introduce herself, that lower class individual might have just as good of a shot at making a good impression as someone with a wealthier background. She just has more pessimistic expectations. So currently we're working on testing these ideas in real networking events, although COVID has slowed down those studies for now. So instead, I'd like to quickly talk about one other consequence of these class-linked meta-perceptions, and that's in people's responses to negative feedback. To talk about that, let's go back to these tweets I showed you earlier. So Kanye here seems pretty surprised to find that fewer people want to follow him than he thought, right? And who does he blame for this? Well, definitely not himself. He says he's been held at this low number of followers. And that's not surprising if we think about how his meta perceptions might affect his attributions for negative feedback. So let's say that Kanye thinks everyone loves and respects him as an artist, whereas Bieber has some doubts. If both artists learned they lost some Twitter followers, so they got some negative feedback about how others see them, it makes sense that Kanye wouldn't blame himself, right? After all, he thinks everyone loves and respects him. But Bieber, who kind of doubts that others see him that positively, might instead think maybe he said something people disliked or he made a lame song that they weren't into. So to put this in more academic terms, what we're proposing is that those with high social class have more positive meta perceptions, which will lead them to attribute failure more to external factors outside of themselves. Whereas those with low social class have more negative meta perceptions, leading them to blame themselves for failure. So here's the general method we've used in a bunch of studies testing this idea. So first, participants will have a real online chat with another participant who's scheduled at the same time as they are. And they report how they think their partner saw them after that chat. After that, they learn there's going to be a second conversation, and both they and their partner can choose whether to have this second conversation with a new person or with the same person again. After this, they find out their partner chose not to have a conversation with them again, so they kind of failed in that first chat. They made a bad impression. And finally, they report their attributions for why this person rejected them. So to do that, we asked people how plausible various explanations were for why their partner didn't choose them. So some of these were internal, blaming the self, like I wasn't likable, I wasn't interesting enough. And others are external, so either blaming your partner, they don't really get me, or blaming something else about the chat, like technical issues. So I'll show you the results from our biggest study on this question. And what we're expecting is to see an interaction between attribution type and social class. So people with lower social class are blaming themselves more and external factors less compared to people with higher social class. And that's exactly what we find. So as social class increases, people become less likely to blame themselves, so that's that blue line, and more likely to blame external factors, the black line. So lower class people are more likely to think it's their own fault they got rejected, and they're less likely to blame their partner or other technical issues. And as we predicted, this interaction pattern is mediated by meta-perceptions. So the differences in attributions for failure by social class can be explained by people's different beliefs about how others see them. So in summary, those with high social class believe others see them more positively, whereas those with lower social class aren't so sure. And this happens for both warmth and competence, despite the stereotype that upper class people are less warm than lower class folks. And this is mediated by self-views and self-presentation. And it predicts blaming yourself less and others more when you receive negative feedback, which could be important for your willingness to keep trying after you fail. So in true Bieber fashion, I want to thank you all humbly for listening to this talk, and also want to thank my collaborators and everyone else who's been involved in this research project.